Okay. On behalf of Economic and Political Weekly, I would like to welcome all of you here on the occasion of the 196th birth anniversary of Mahatma Jyotirao Phule, and of course the upcoming 132nd birth anniversary of Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar. So we planned this webinar to explore the various streams of critique that form the reservoir, or perhaps a better word would be the river of anti-caste thought in India. So following Ambedkar's statement that Phule, Kabir and the Buddha were his three gurus or teachers, this webinar intends to focus on the intellectual bridges between various emancipatory personalities who have historically contributed towards keeping a critical and heterodox tradition of thought alive in India. So given the contemporary climate of amnesia and erasure of history by various state and societal forces, we felt that it is really important to remember the tradition of dissent straddling all of India's different time periods of ancient, medieval, and modern history. So our really brilliant panelists today would surely shed some important light on the alternative ways of remembering, commemorating, and thinking with and against the tradition of the tradition of critical thought in India. Something that we feel is exemplified by the work of Mahatma Phule and Babasaheb Ambedkar, whose birth anniversaries we are, of course, celebrating this week. So before I introduce our panelists, just a couple of brief remarks about why I think this event of Mahatma Phule's birth anniversary is really significant. Mahatma Phule, for me, especially, exemplifies the importance of critical thought, because all through his works, one can sense a tremendous attention to detail for what Phule himself termed as cunning, as is the title of one of his books, The Cunning of Brahmanism, Brahmananche Kasab. So although names of hegemonic ideologies might change, what is perhaps constant in all unjust systems of theory and practice is the element of their cunning, because of which such systems perpetuate a mental or intellectual dominance over those oppressed by it. So this is really the importance of liberatory education, as initiated by Savitribai and Jyotirao Phule, which more than anything else is supposed to open a critical horizon of thought for an individual, which Mahatma Phule, of course, described as Trutiya Ratna, the third eye. So which is, I think, a brilliant metaphor for thinking critically about and against the cunning of ruling ideologies, so that we can cultivate a more emancipatory consciousness. So with these remarks, I would like to introduce today's speakers, and they'll be speaking in this order as well. So first, Professor Mukti Lakhi Mangharam would be speaking. Professor Mukti is an associate professor at Rutgers University, New Jersey, and she's worked on world literatures and post-colonial studies, human rights and literature, comparative modernities, feminism and gender studies, etc. Then Professor Umesh Bagade will be speaking, who is a professor at the Babasaheb Ambedkar Marathwada University, Aurangabad. Among his wide array of influential writings, some notable titles are Dalit Zanivetil Dwandva, Prabhutvani Pratikar, which in English would be The Dialectics of Dalit Consciousness, Dominance and Resistance, published by Sugawa Prakashan, and the very influential Ambedkar's Historical Method, a non-Brahminic critique of positivist history, published by Critical Quest. Then Dr. Karthick Ram Manoharan would be speaking, who was previously a Mary Skłodowska-Curie Actions Individual Fellow at the University of Wolverhampton, where he worked on the project titled Freedom from Caste, the Political Thought of Periyar E.V. Ramaswamy in a Global Context. He's currently an assistant professor at the National Law School of India University in Bengaluru. And Professor Gopal Guru, who is the editor of EPW and has been the author of two very influential books, The Cracked Mirror, an Indian debate on experience and theory, and the subsequent work, Experience, Caste and Everyday Social, both co-authored with Professor Sundar Sarukkai. Professor Guru will be our discussant for today, who will be, rounding off all the theoretical interventions made by our panelists. After that, we'll have a Q&A session, and all our panelists are requested to speak for about 8 to 10 minutes, after which I will have to maybe hint that we are running out of time. So I would now like to invite Professor Mukti to speak on her topic today. Yeah.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be part of this panel. I'm honored to actually be in discussion with all of you today. And I'm going to start by sharing my screen. I have a PowerPoint. All right, so I'll begin. My work is interested in radical movements for equality that undermine hierarchies by defining what unites people. I look, in other words, to ideas of freedom that appear in local forms and that speak to each other as they circulate globally. I ask, how do we rethink the binary of tradition versus modernity if we look towards buried pathways to national liberation posed by supposedly traditional versions of ideas of liberation, equality, and radical inclusion? This work resists some key assumptions about Indian history. The first assumption is that colonialism brought modern ideas of human rights and that everything that came before is tradition. In fact, I argue that this binary of tradition versus modernity is a colonial legacy that itself really does not mean much because ideas that are labeled as modern, like freedom and equality, often arose from the reworked religiosities that are too often regarded and dismissed as tradition. They are seen as somehow irretrievable or somehow being a sign of absolute difference or being illegible. But Ambedkar's use of these Nirgun Bhakti traditions and his reinvention of Buddhism to articulate freedom challenges these assumptions. He reworked and made new these traditional forms of critique to resist systems of degradation like the caste system. Second is the assumption that these ideas of freedom and equality were always imported from Europe. Rather, I argue that they arose in many places and they were revitalized as responses to pre existing and colonial capitalist forms of exploitation. Ambedkar's versions of radical tradition allied many different philosophies of liberation from different places together. There were no European versus Indian or tradition versus modernity binaries in his works. As his call for liberty, equality, and fraternity shows, Ambedkar used whatever was useful to him in his quest for social justice, paying attention to the quality of these ideas rather than their sources. I'll now take us through three examples of these ideas in the thought of Ambedkar, ideas that I call contextual universalisms. This term may be familiar to readers of my book, Literatures of Liberation, Non-European Universalisms and Democratic Progress. By universalisms, I mean discourses that propose universal categories like humanity and then elaborate concepts like equality, freedom, or reason as universal attributes of those categories. These are discourses that think about how the world should be and that base these norms of how the world should be on a presumption of universality. By contextual, I mean that these ideas of rationality, freedom, and equality are born in various contexts, in local forms, all over the world, in response to forms of power like the caste system, like colonial hegemony, like capitalist extraction. So these contextual universalisms are expressed through an oppositional political engagement in many different kinds of aesthetic forms. They have lineages in vernacular folkways like Kabir and in radical social struggle. So I want to turn to three examples of Ambedkar's contextual universalisms of freedom, which he harnessed against the caste system and which refused the tradition versus modernity binary, and also the other binaries that came with it, like that of religion versus rationality. So the first part of the diagram is based on Kabir, Nirgun Bhakti notions of equality. And we all know that Kabir was an important source of inspiration to Ambedkar because the Kabir tradition emphasized that people were not to be judged by predetermined identity categories, but by the nature of their work in the world. This was a deeply rational form of questioning that arose from within the category of spirituality. Take, for instance, the verse in the diagram, which insists that the Pandit derive his knowledge about the world not from his belief systems, but from the empirical evidence around him, that we eat by touching, from a touch the world is born, so who's untouched, says Kabir. So, in other words, systems that did judge people through predetermined categories like caste had to be challenged. The Kabir tradition critiques upper caste Hindu structures of religiosity and targets the Pandit and the hierarchy that the Pandit is a part of. But at the same time, this tradition arises from radical religiosities, right? So it's not opposed to rationality, it's a rationality born from within radical religiosities. Secondly, the second contextual universalism is the pragmatist idea of individual freedom as individuality operating in and for the common interest. Professor John Dewey was Ambedkar's advisor at Columbia University, where he did his PhD, and was the founder of the American School of Pragmatism, which was a philosophical school that held that ideas had to be judged by their practical effects in the world. And Ambedkar used this school of philosophy to ground his idea of social reform. So what does individuality operating in and for the common interest means? It means that the agency possessed by an individual within a context where one's interests as a Dalit coincide with the larger common interest of the society as a whole. So this is an idea that recognizes that a Dalit cannot be free until society lets him or her be free. So his or her freedom can only happen in an open field unobstructed by others. Only where a Dalit's will can synergize with the will of everyone else can a common interest be born, and this common interest will then give free play to everybody's individual agency, including Dalit individual agency. So if we look at the idea of positive freedom as the capacity to act on one's will, Ambedkar argued in Annihilation of Caste that that cannot happen unless we also are able to achieve negative freedom, which is the capacity to act unobstructed by others, right? And that capacity has to be socially engineered through legislation that makes sure that discrimination against Dalits is not upheld by society. So laws have to be enforced against caste discrimination and segregation. India has to produce experiences of associated living and the common interests that flow from that conjoint communicated experience. Ambedkar was very upset by India's lack of these values. He argued that, quote, caste in India is exclusive and isolated. What a caste or a combination of castes regard as their own interest as against other castes remains as sacred and inviolate as ever, end quote. The result is that, quote, there's no common plane on which the privileged and the subject classes can meet. This separation has caused the educated to become slaves and created the psychological complex which follows from a slave mentality. In the upper castes, on the other hand, isolation and exclusiveness creates the antisocial spirit of a gang. I go back to our diagram of contextual universalism. The third contextual universalism in Ambedkar's thought is his remaking of Buddhism into Navayana Buddhism, which articulated the idea of rational action through the idea that one's responsibility for oneself is in actuality a responsibility for the entire Sangha or community. The idea that self and other are not two, and this is a quote from the Buddha and his Dham, is apparent in the Dalit journalist Yashika Dutt's memoir Coming Out as Dalit, in which she describes the act of passing as a betrayal of the community because it upholds the very hierarchies that deny those rights to other Dalits. So Yashika expresses her own shame at passing and admires Rohit Vemula for staying true to Ambedkar's vision and of bravely laying claim to his Dalit identity due to his belief in caste equality. And I've got some quotes from her memoir here. Unlike me, Rohit did nothing to bury his Dalitness. Instead, he used it as a shield to stand up for his fellow Dalit students in Hyderabad University against the caste-based prejudice of members of the administration. Her memoir is penance for passing, for laying claim to rights given to upper castes while not working to expand those rights to other Dalits. Yashika realizes that coming out as Dalit means that she is finally free because her individual will has now been harnessed towards creating a common interest that includes her community and that takes responsibility for the well-being of all Dalits, just as Rohit Vemula did. She says, after I came out as Dalit, I no longer had anything to hide. Everything about my life was connected to a larger narrative. Everything that I had done so far or that had happened to me was somehow related to my caste. But I didn't want to tell just my story. I also wanted to tell the stories of all those Dalits that the media and society at large had ignored. Through their accounts and by making sense of my own life, I have tried to piece together a larger picture of what casteism looks like today. So this reading of the Dalit memoir comes from my new book, Freedom Inc. And I bring it into play here because in the Dalit memoir and particularly in this one, the lineages of Ambedkar's contextual universalisms, the pragmatist idea of individuality in and for the common interest, and also his Buddhist idea of taking responsibility for the uplift of the entire community rather than just pursuing the individual good and individual upliftment, which a lot of current discourses of freedom are highlighting, right? Those strands are still very much alive. They're still apparent in a lot of Dalit political consciousness. And they come from these lineages that were espoused and brought together so beautifully in Ambedkar's vast corpus of writing. So Yashika Dutt's life story becomes representative of the trials and tribulations faced by other Dalits and works towards recognizing and eradicating the constraints that the whole community faces, thereby going some way towards realizing the common interest and shared responsibility for other Dalits that Ambedkar wished for. Ambedkar's legacy reminds us that there are pathways to national liberation that are not caught up in exclusionary binaries and that define the nation state through projects of radical inclusion rather than through colonial hierarchies. They diagnose what is wrong with an increasingly ascendant, state-led vision of what sets Hindu India apart from the rest of the world. They show that without dealing with the deep roots of social oppression, India continues to, in Ambedkar's words, build a palace on a dung heap. In the process, they highlight the potential of radical contextual universalisms towards achieving a truer national liberation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Mukti. This was an absolutely enervating, I suppose, intervention into the political thought of Ambedkar. I found a lot of ideas striking here, but most importantly, the universalist character of Ambedkar, I suppose, goes beyond the concerns of the Desi or the derivative, the indigenous as well as the derivative, universes of political thought in colonial India, and that was very well, pointed out by you in your talk. We'll have more things to discuss in the Q&A. So I'll now ask Professor Umesh Bagade to speak. Sir, you can speak now.
A discussion by quoting Dr. Ambedkar from Untouchable. He writes, "We must not forget that in Indian tradition, nothing ever gets destroyed. It only gets transformed, taking on difficult names and forms. Different names and forms. Followers of Buddha were spread throughout Maharashtra for 1,000 and 1,500 years until just before the Jnanadev and Jnanadev. It is historically inconsistent to think that a philosopher who took pride in Vedic religion would have had a power to completely erase 10 or 15 centuries profound influence on the folk mind. Indeed, that influence was strong enough that even such a philosopher was cursed as Buddhist in disguise." Ambedkar is emphasizing that there are continuities of Buddhist thought, which as a heterodox religion, we all know that it is linked with Phule and Ambedkar. And you might be knowing that particularly the anti-caste thought which emerged within the Bhakti tradition, it also took kind of inspiration from Vajrasuchi, which was the text written by Ashwaghosh, that had a subaltern founding. I will cite that particularly in Mahatma, which was written in 1856, there was critique of caste. And that critique of caste is grounded on the logic of Vajrasuchi. Vajrasuchi offers the logic that if at all the bodily attributes, the bodily functions are similar, then there cannot be inequalities. Brahmin, Kshatriya, Vaishya, and Shudra, they have same body. So there cannot be any mark of differentiation. So this is a logic which is offered by Vajrasuchi, is invoked by the Mahatma, a kind of caste origin Quran written by Mahars in 1856. So one can understand that even the subaltern logic is, in certain sense, is holding the ground of the logic of Vajrasuchi. Secondly, one has to understand that this logic pervaded in all kinds of, you can say, resistances put forth by the Dalit activists like Gopal Guru. If you read Gopal Guru's text, Vitar Vidhamsan, you will find that he is quoting all heterodox traditions. He is quoting Vajrasuchi, he is quoting Tantra cult, he is quoting the Bhakti tradition. He, in certain sense, also taking the logic which was there in the Mahatma. Mahatma asked the pertinent question that if at all, if anybody kills pure cow and eats cow, he's not untouchable. Those who are wearing the footwears from cows, made up of cows, they are not untouchables. And why then those who are eating dead cows are turned as untouchables? This is a question which is posed in the Mahatma, is similarly posed by this Gopal Guru. So there are continuities of logic. There is continuities of the way reason is operated to, can say, fight against caste. So this is an interesting kind of, you can say, logic which was prevailing in the kind of, we can say, subaltern kind of consciousness. And similarly, one has to, can say, see Mahatma Phule as a thinker who, in certain sense, has identified the kind of anti-caste tradition of Charvaka, Jain and Buddhist tradition. I will cite the kind of dialogue or kind of, you can say, always Phule is seen as the man who was influenced by missionaries. But the kind of critique which Phule was offering was largely based on the empiricism which he has gained from the Indian tradition, heterodox tradition of Charvaka and Udvayata. Mahatma Phule, particularly in Shetkar and Sasu, the Code of Armor, gives quotes of Charvaka, particularly the heterodox tradition, from Horai's writing. Horais has written on Sanskrit books, and he has quoted Sarvadarshan Sarasangra. So he has taken several kinds of quotes. And interestingly, on the basis of the philosophy of Buddhism and philosophy of Charvaka, Phule, in certain sense, offered critique of Hindu religion. Phule, in Sarvajanik Satyadharma, writes a chapter on Tarka, that is logic. And Phule has given three kinds of Tarka. One kind of Tarka where the answer is sought through the relationship between Karta Karma, that is the actor and act. So broadly, the kind of, we can say, Pratyaksha is seen as category to derive knowledge. This is one way of, we can say, ascertaining knowledge, one path of ascertaining knowledge. The other path of other logic which he offers is the logic of inference, and that logic is also, in certain sense, affirmed by Mahatma Phule. Mahatma Phule then offers a third kind of logic. He says this logic is based on wavering shapes of imagination. This is the interesting kind of logic he offers, and then explains what is this logic. To explain this logic, Mahatma Phule gives a certain kind of example. He quotes Jnaneshwari. There are Jnaneshwari's 12 adhyay, which is a commentary of Gita, 12 chapter and 13 chapter. I will cite only one kind of, aspect of it. He, in certain sense, categorically observes that what is the wavering shape of imagination. For example, this is the idea of Atman. Idea of Atman is nothing but a kind of notion, conception based on imagination. He argues that have anybody seen the Atman without body? So we will find that he categorically rejects all kind of ideas which are based on imagination. For him, the idea of Atman, idea of Brahman, idea of moksha, idea of heaven, idea of narak, all such ideas, idea of prarabdha, idea of sanchit, idea of nasib, all these ideas are ideas of imagination. And there he argues that if at all you have to take up the path of knowledge, then you should seek the first two logics, not the third logic. While criticizing Hindu religion, particularly the Shraddha and other things, he quotes various kinds of, we can say, quotations from Charvaka, Brihaspati. For example, Brihaspati talks about the profession of Brahmins who are, in certain sense, fooling the common masses by cunning, or exactly what you have said. And that is, in certain sense, is quoted by Mahatma Phule. So you have to understand that this empirical logic, which was continuously being holding ground in India, is taken by Mahatma Phule to fight against the unreasonable aspect of Hinduism or the certain kind of conception of Hinduism. This is the second aspect of what we can connect Phule and the heterodox tradition. The third aspect which we will be taking is the aspect of the way Mahatma Phule has defined caste as slavery. You have to understand that caste is seen as slavery by Mahatma Phule as well as Babasaheb Ambedkar. And you will see there are certain kinds of, can say, analysis which are very closer to each other. And the most important part of Mahatma Phule, he is conceiving the slavery through a category of avidya. It's interesting that avidya is the Indian category, the philosophy category, discussed by various kinds of philosophies. Avidya is discussed by Advaita philosophy, Advaita Vedanta philosophy. It is also discussed by Buddhist philosophy. Particularly in the Hindu philosophy or Advaita philosophy, this is seen as the first reason, which is in certain sense is this guy or failing, knowing the Brahma is Atman. So because of avidya, one cannot have a knowledge that Atman is Brahman. That is the cause of, you can say, avidya. This is the answer given by the Vedantic tradition. And particularly, there are two different kind of, you can say, notions of the Buddhist notions. And the most important notion of Buddhism is that avidya is the wrong conception of self and the world. This whole kind of idea of avidya is very important in the writing of Mahatma Phule. And the idea of avidya in certain sense is the category through which we can grapple the very specificity of the way the Indian caste system inflicts slavery. So this idea of mental slavery is in certain sense is probed by Mahatma Phule through the category of avidya, which comes from the tradition of Buddhism. So one has to understand that, yes, this is an interesting kind of, you can say, ways Mahatma Phule was it's taking kind of, you can say, lineage from Buddhism. Third important aspect about Buddhism is the first kind of, you can say, philosophy, which in certain sense claim that the empirical experience is the ground for knowledge. And similarly, when particularly Buddha argues that how the knowledge can be derived from the experience, Buddha claims that there is conditioning. So if at all you can remove conditioning of mind, then and then only you can have the experience which can turn into knowledge. So Buddha has given a kind of, you can say, condition for using experience into knowledge. And particularly for Mahatma Phule, that the individuals, men and women, has to unconditional themselves from the Brahmanism. Until they are not unconditioning themselves from Brahmanism, they cannot turn their experience into knowledge. So we'll find there are several ways Dr. Ambedkar, Mahatma Phule, and Buddhism are linked. One can see that the way Phule and Ambedkar are linked, and you will find that's the way both are offering logics, have some kind of, we can say, piercing understanding of Indian reality. For example, particularly Vajrasuchi fails to, in certain sense, understand the nuance of Varna. Particularly, you might be knowing Rupa Kulkarni has given two versions of Vajrasuchi. One version is Brahminical Vajrasuchi, the other is Buddhist Vajrasuchi. But whatever so, there is argument that Brahmins are those who are having attributes of Brahmin. Brahmin is not Atman, Brahmin is not body, Brahmin is not Jiva. These are kinds of arguments which are offered by Vajrasuchi. And one of the arguments that then what is Brahmin? Brahmin is the kind of attribute, Shama, Dhamma, Tapa. The same kind of, you can say, logic is invoked by Gita. And that this comes particularly Gita's 18 chapter and 42 shloka, where it says that Brahmin are those who have that kind of attributes of Brahmin. Interestingly, Mahatma Phule argues that Gita was a Dao-Pechi book, means cunning book. It's a Dao-Pechi book. He also says it is superstitious book. He says Thotandi book. These are his words. So one has to understand that this stance, where he takes quote from Gita, and here he argues that whatever you are saying, this is unreasonable. This is nothing but the imaginary way of thinking about society. Gita assures that society will be run through the principle of guna karma. And here, categorically, Phule argues against it, that the guna karma notion is nothing but fiction. It cannot be practiced in reality. And you have to understand that the modern way of defense caste comes through the logic that Gita allows varna on the basis of guna karma. So it is a rational, which is in certain sense was argued by Tilak, it was argued by many more thinkers, and Mahatma Phule argues against it. Similarly, you have to understand that the similar stance is taken by Dr. Ambedkar. Ambedkar says Gita is Dao-Pechi. He forthright clearly says it is the Manusmriti in nutshell. This is the words of Dr. Ambedkar. Ambedkar also treats Gita as a text which is cunning, and he claims that Gita is the text of counter-revolution. One has to understand these facets that he, in certain sense, decries the principle of guna karma. He says that varnashram dharma is not just, and then the logic is not reasonable. Guna karma vibhaksha is not reasonable. So you'll find there are similarities of critique of Gita. The same kind of logic will be continued within both of them. The kind of stance they are taking towards Gita is one and the same. Secondly, one has to understand that how caste as slavery operates. So what is the role of Brahmanism? And Mahatma Phule defines Brahmanism in his own way, and you will find Dr. Ambedkar also defines the role of Brahmanism in his own way. So for both of them, annihilation of caste has to be carried out through demolition of Brahmanism. So it's essential kind of precondition for carrying out anti-caste revolution. So both in certain sense are offering the critique of Brahmanism. I don't have that much of time, but I will drag only this point and I will stop here because I think I have completed my 10 minutes. Thank you. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to make my points before you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Bagade. I mean, it was absolutely wide-ranging. The kind of sources that you consulted all throughout your talk, they are, I mean, scintillating to observe, from Buddhism to Lokayata to Charvak. Of course, connecting to the Bhakti tradition, coming to Mahatma Phule and Babasaheb Ambedkar. One source that I would maybe add to this illustrious list is the name of Shakespeare, because we know that Mahatma Phule had referred to Othello in the English preface of Gulamgiri. And one sentence from another work of Shakespeare that I really find resonant with Phule is this sentence from The Tempest, which read, "Hell is empty because all the devils are here." So Mahatma Phule's whole criticism of theology is, I feel, nothing but a critique of a society which has become devilish in some senses. So Thank you again for that extremely comprehensive presentation. Now, I would like to invite Dr. Karthick Manoharan. Dr. Karthik, you may please speak now.
Thank you so much, Ankit, and special thanks to my fellow panelists and to the chair, Professor Gopal Guru, whose work I really admire so much, and to the EPW for inviting me. And so with a Jai Phule and a Jai Beam, let me start with my presentation. And I don't want this to be sort of a academic presentation. I just want this to be more of a conversation with the so many different viewpoints that have been discussed before me. There is much that I've learned from, and there's much that I concur with. And let me just start off with my understanding of critique, right? So critique is different from criticism because it necessarily involves an appraisal which is guided towards action, especially an action that should change the world for better, right? So insofar as critique is concerned, it is different from the act of hermeneutics, and it's a lot closer to Karl Marx's famous statement in the thesis of Feuerbach that philosophers have interpreted the world in different ways. Point, however, is to change it. So critique is the sort of ideation which is goes into not just interpreting the world, but also arriving at ways for changing it. So when Etienne Balibar wrote his essay Critique in the 21st Century, he argued that capital and religion are two terrains in which towards which critique is directed, and also pose the question if there are other terrains towards which we can direct them as well. So coming from India, caste definitely is one such terrain, and we also know how much caste colors capital and caste colors religion, and is in turn colored by it, right? So critique in India necessarily has to be a critique of caste and its different sort of manifestations. So in one of my recent works, and if I may share the screen over here, this is a bit of show and tell. So I hope it's okay. So slideshow. Can you see my screen? Yeah.
We can see it, yeah.
Yeah. So in one of my recent works, a Periyar study in political atheism, which was just published by Orient Black Swan last year, I explore Periyar's critique of political theology. So the general accusation against Periyar has been that he has been a crude atheist who just made some dirty jokes about religions and religious figures, who said some nasty things about Lord Rama and Lord Shiva, and he just did things to hurt the sentiments of the Hindus. Now, that's definitely partially true. There is an element of truth in it. But having said that, his criticism was not just a criticism of religion, it was a critique of political theology. Important to this critique is the understanding that in India, religion and state power often overlapped, and religion empowered a caste elite to capture or influence state power to their interests at the expense of the interests. Look at Periyar's thoughts as a form of political atheism, which is a critique of the political theology of Brahmanism. Now, by Periyar's critique of Brahmanism, I don't mean that he's focused on attacking a particular caste and the customs. while it does appear that he is excessively critical of the Brahmin caste and community, Periyar's critique of political theology as such carries realistic chauvinism of caste supremacy and of religious fundamentalism in all its forms. So I look at Periyar's political atheism fundamentally as a criticism of the manner in which the modern nation state and religion tend to, Schmidt's exact term, secularized theological concepts dominate forms of politics, and why there is an imperative to imagine alternate forms of politics. And we can see the times because the religious identitarian way the dominant mode, while secularism or the secular alternatives of looking at politics. Now, I understand that the word secular comes with its own problems when we use in a country like India. But having said that, an alternative to a majoritarian religious politics does face several forms of difficulties. So, keeping that in mind, in the course of this conversation, I just want to present 10 hypotheses on a critique of caste, which I believe should be incorporated in quotidian politics, especially one that looks for a secular and more inclusive India. But before that, just a little bit of I'll just very briefly touch upon Periyar's relations to the other two major pan-Indian caste, anti-caste thinkers whom we are discussing today, namely Mahatma Phule and Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar. So, in my recent essay published on EPW Engage, titled Sudras and the Nation, I discuss how Periyar saw the Shudra community as non-Brahmins and non-Dalits who were deprived or devoid of self-respect. And he often used Shudra as a sort of a abusive term to challenge non-Brahmin castes, especially the dominant ones, for their subservience to the Brahmins and for their sense of superiority over the Dalits. Yeah, anyway, so so over here, Periyar uses the term Shudra not only to insist upon the difference of the non-Brahmin, South Indian non-Brahmin community from the Brahmin community, but also to constantly remind the intermediate caste that their ideas of superiority or supremacy over the Dalits are very flawed, and that they should make common cause with the Dalits, right? So as early as 1935, with when referring to the Dalit question, Periyar urged the Tamil Dalits to look up to Ambedkar as a national leader, and in 1936 he advised them to follow Ambedkar's path. Further, in the 1950s, Periyar said that Ambedkar was a leader not just for the Dalits but for all Indians, and that the Tamils should name their children after Ambedkar in gratitude to his contributions for their uplift. So, to give a sort of a sample of the sort of support which Periyar gave to Ambedkar during a crucial period, between 1932 and 1944, the Kudiyarasu, the party paper edited by Periyar, published 37 articles in support of Ambedkar with respect to the Pune Pact. So Periyar saw Dalits as natural self-respecters, and he urged the OBC and the MBC communities to make common cause with them. And apart from just focusing on reservations and redistribution for the Dalits, he also supported religious and secular forms of Dalit militant politics. Now, I expand upon these themes in an earlier paper of mine called In the Path of Ambedkar, Periyar and the Dalit Question, which has been published. Now, let me just move to my 10 hypotheses on the 21st century critique of caste, right? So for long, Indian liberals have been very active when it comes to condemning anti-Muslim violence. Mainly so because anti-Muslim violence occurs in urban spaces, it is highly visible, and it affects the dominant narrative of Indian secularism, which of course is no longer dominant now. Caste violence has, on the other hand, for long been ignored until recently. My second argument or second critique is that physical violence is an aspect of caste, but the nature of caste violence is structural violence. I think of late, the singular focus on physical violence through atrocity reporting or victimhood narratives deflects attention from addressing structural questions regarding caste. My third critique. Dalits are often and the most affected and even the worst affected by the physical violence and the structural violence of caste. But they are not the only ones affected. The OBCs may not face as much as physical violence as the Dalits, and in some cases, they may also be perpetrators of violence against Dalits. But they are also structured, scholars like Satish Deshpande, Yogendra Yadav, and others. OBCs are dismally represented in central government institutions and media. I believe that the OBC question deserves greater attention than what has been given to it. My fourth hypothesis. Of the 5,000 OBC castes in India, a few dozen at the most have gained social and economic mobility. The rest, whom we can safely call the Bahujan lot, are the people in majority in India and the majority of the poor in India. So loose statements calling OBCs as the new elites, stereotyping them as violent, or criminalizing the lot as anti-Dalit are both academically unsound, and I would say they are also politically problematic. 5. Having a pro-Dalit position is not equal to having an anti-caste position. I think this was a very strong criticism laid by Dr. Ambedkar against Gandhi, that his outreach towards the Harijans did not, quote unquote Harijans, did not de facto constitute an anti-caste position. Because the sort of performative allyship by upper caste activists and intellectuals seems to assume that having a pro-Dalit position equals an anti-caste position. This ignorance of caste as a system with graded hierarchies and inequalities is perfectly consistent with the caste ideological order. In fact, of late, even the Hindu right admits that the Dalits need empowerment. Radical anti-casteism needs to see and do something more than this. Isolating caste particularism and ignoring the sort of shared oppression, not the same oppression, but a shared oppression of different sections of Dalits and OBCs is not anti-casteism. Seventhly, Brahmanism as an ideology can be defined as a system of graded inequality that seals caste in particularist identities and prevents the emergence of any radical universalist politics that could, challenge its existence. Particularism, on the other hand, does not challenge Brahmanism and only reinforces it. So over here, perhaps I'm deriving, some points from Mukti's own work, of imagining a new and different form of universalism from non-Western sources. 8th, anti-casteism cannot be an one-size-fits-all narrative for India. Regional histories and politics of resistance need to be taken into account, and solidarities must be built on that basis. A meta-theory of anti-casteism is necessary, which must nevertheless be informed by the local and be localized in practice. Related to that, my ninth hypothesis is that apart from foundational anti-caste thinkers like Phule, Ambedkar, and Periyar, political leaders like Annadurai, Ram Manohar Lohia, Kanchiram, and their successors were also able to bring about counter-hegemonic political alliances of Dalit Bahujan caste with varying degrees of success. They must also be taken seriously into account. Finally, to conclude, the particular can be the position of denunciation of casteism. The universal needs to be the position of enunciation of emancipation. I argue that there needs to be an imagination of a new universal subject who, from being anti-caste, moves to a position of total freedom from caste. This perhaps could strengthen the critiques of caste that we are trying to develop in the 21st century. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Karthik, for this amazingly wide-ranging and I must say very, very thought-provoking presentation as well. I mean, the 10 theses are politically so powerful that I can, think about each thesis as being an article in itself in a way, I mean, which invites so much thought and so much sensitive consideration. And to the point of saying that this is how an issue of shared interest is supposed to be, discussed, whereas we very evidently saw the inability to as much as articulate a single thought during the course of your presentation as well by certain trollers. So you are quite popular, I must say. So from there, I'd like to now invite Professor Guru to discuss all the three brilliant presentations. Sir, can you speak now, please?
I think all the three presentations were to the point that they thought were important. And I think they have raised the crucial points that really form the part of the debate on what is critique and what is critique as tradition, though we haven't really defined what critique as tradition. One of the important scholars of Ambedkar, Professor Valerian Rodriguez, wrote some time back, making tradition critical. And this is a reference to Dr. Ambedkar's work on New Buddhism. Now, what is the difference between the two? Critique as tradition and making tradition critical. This is what is the point that we must really pursue further. But I will do that later on in my last final comment. I think these points, the 3 points, three scholars have raised few different points and few common points. One of the common points was universalism and contextual universalism, which has been there in the international imagination and thinking, that as against the so-called mainstream universalism, there can be a contextual universalism. And we have not been able to really define what is context and what is universalism. Are these tools, are they overlapping entities, or they are different, or they are pragmatically joined together? Because pragmatism and contextual universalism will actually sit very, very close to each other. They're very happily to each other. So universalism cannot be contextualized because it is universally valid and it is universally accepted framework. So what is this contextual universalism is the problem. Can we really remove that tag contextual or context-bound universalism? And if you want to really remove that tag of a context, what are the resources that you have at your disposal, the epistemological, the methodological, and the language, and all that. So that question remains to be addressed. Of course, one can always say that, the language of contemporary, in the language of contemporary, you'll find what is global is also simultaneously local. So your universalism is global, at the same time it is local as well. So do you want to buy into this framework? And if you want to buy into in this framework, what implication does it have for the political emancipatory thought of the three thinkers we have just discussed? So this is a very complex question, and we don't have any straightforward and easy answer to this question. But that apart, I think the binary that that was the construction of the colonial thinking has been challenged by, of course, Ambedkar, if not so much by Periyar. I think Karthik might reflect on this because he was attracted to socialism so much. Periyar. So this binary is a very disenabling thinking. And can you really replace binary with this initial condition and the essential condition? And if you take this enabling framework, you will then say there's an enabling part of the colonial modernity, and everyone actually celebrating that, particularly from the Dalit and the Bahujan. Phule himself actually quoted, he actually he acknowledged, he actually dedicated his work to Negroes of the American, and Thomas Paine and all that, So it's very difficult to draw a very clear-cut, neat binary division. So what we can then say is, of course, for the initial condition, you will have to borrow resources from everywhere. Just because emancipatory ideas have no address, they can be there everywhere in the air. You just catch them with your ability to really catch them. And this is the point I've been discussing with Professor Gulpreet Mahajan for a very long time. So, do ideas and concepts have address? Can you really peg them into something else? And we just can't do it, particularly for those who are from the margin, women, Dalit, Adivasi, and the tribals and others, Adivasi and other neglected social groups. They are looking for it. So I think the tradition is built up. It is not given in gift. Therefore, the challenge before the Dalit stroke Bahujan, and I don't really want to make this there's no hyphen between the two of them. Despite the fact that Karthik was making some references to BBC now, that I don't really see any hyphen. A hyphen can be created. I'm not ruling out that possibility, but there's no hyphen at the moment. Now we have to create the hyphen. There's a bar between the two of them. I mean, this is a politically correct language we use. There's a bar, Dalit and Bahujan, but I think that is unrealistic. This is not according to the truth. That the way it unfolds in the practical politics that happens in a country. So you will have to actually think about the about those people who are from the margin and they have no resources given in gift. They have to create, and they are actually creating it. It's like the Spider-Man, almost the Spider-Man. This is one way of looking at it. Spider-Man has its own energy to create the net. So most of the Dalit writers are like Spider-Man, but yet those who are actually thinkers, they will have to borrow some critical impulses from the tradition, from the radical tradition that are available in given situation. They may be abroad, they may be here. But Umesh has given a wonderful clue to us that Mahatma is one of the important sources that has actually given us a new idea about what is freedom, what is equality. You don't have to go to French Revolution for that matter. And there's a debate whether Dr. Ambedkar borrowed from French Revolution or was it there in Buddhism. So I think these are all very emotive debates, and we don't want to get into those emotive debates. And the initial and the essential. What is essential is actually building of the metaphysics of emancipation. How to do it with moral realism? All that is the question that we have to address. So I think binaries are disabling, and we have to replace them with new language like initial and the essential. Otherwise, the post-colonial theories will really be very happy to attack this binary and for right reason, good reasons. But we from here will have to look at it differently. We just can't throw the baby along with bathwater. We don't want to perfect it, but that's it from our point of view. Now the other point is, what should we how do we actually build up bridges among the three? Now the challenge, the methodological challenge is that can you really are they really borrowing in wholesale ideas that are critical but also historically given to us? So the function of the critique is very reflective, in the sense that you don't borrow whatever is there. It's not a wholesale borrowing from it. It's a very selective borrowing from the tradition that are available either in India or abroad. And that's why it is Neo Buddhism. It wouldn't be otherwise, but it is Neo Buddhism. So there is a critical borrowing from the emancipatory impulses from our own thought, and that's why you have the tradition. So the emancipatory tradition, critic as tradition, actually has to approximate all the critical impulses that are there at the disposal of the people who are interested in emancipating or annihilating caste or all that. So this is one point for consideration. Second point, I think, and I will make a small point. Now, are we looking for a perfect system of thought? Karthik was right when he says, criticism is actually dismissive, disenabling, but critique is not. Actually, critique has the function to actually provide energy to people to participate in praxis. Without, if the critic is not able to produce conditions for conducting praxis, I think it is not a critic. It's very disabling. So I think there are, I have several pointers to define what is critique, but at the moment I will restrain from doing that. But the real problem is that why Ambedkarism, why Phuleism? We are actually drawn into that ism as if then you will have to confront this reality that thought is a complete thought. Dr. Ambedkar's ism is the ism which has been which is almost achieved some perfection, and we don't want to go. We can't just do without it or beyond it. So that's the. Now, how do we deal with this? We'll have to actually juxtapose this with other isms and then find out which ism will actually really survive in the field. These are combating isms, and they have to be combating. And if they are not combating, you will have to summon the critic to your command to make them combating. Otherwise, and it happens in the field of politics. So let us assess. Let us draw some parameters. Is Ambedkarism very close? Does it resonate with Black thinkers or Scandinavian thinkers? And if you think that it really resonates, then what are the common grounds? What are the common grounds in terms of epistemology? The normative framework, so to say. I'm not talking about epistemology and methodology. Only the normative vision of the society. So I'm already saying that universalism has to really cross boundaries. But let us not make it easy. Dalit, the caste matters just like race matters. It's not a simple reduction to that. Mukti knows it, who knows it very well in the US. Those who, I have my own critique of this. Let us not simplify it to the extent that it becomes absurd. So so I think this is, so we'll have to see, but then it's Hegelian challenge. Then you have to prove, instead of using contextual universalism, you can always say, no, my universalism is not context bound. It may be applicable to everybody outside country or outside the context. But your challenge is to really see that your particular also has universal in it. And you have to inflate it with the ability of yours. You have to amplify it with your resources. Otherwise, it becomes another framework within which we can actually, operate or play around. And so I think that's the point I would. But I think you raised, three of you have raised important points which are relevant points. You did not refer to the contemporary opinions, if not debate opinions about all this Periyar, Phule and Ambedkar. These are all opinions, and politicians are really reduce them to opinions and emotions and Ghoshwakya, slogans. But you are actually liberating all the three thinkers from this Ghoshwakya. You cannot bind them into Ghoshwakya or slogans. They have become slogan, or they have become statues, frozen statues with only one dimension. So that's it. So thanks, Ankit.
Thank you so much, sir, for these extremely generative comments. I mean, something that I took from your comments was this whole distinction between local and colonial configurations of power. So borrowing from all the three presentations today, one may very well say that without criticizing the local configuration of power, which is hegemony of, say, a religion or caste and so on, and directly jumping on to, say, empire, critiques of empire or colonialism, one cannot even be sufficiently universalist. So for any project of universalist politics or universalist thought, the critique of what might be located in a small patch of land in the entire territory of the world is as important as the critique of caste in the subcontinent is important, and so on. So with these questions, I'll begin the Q&A, I suppose. Professor Mukti, you want to say something, I guess?
Yes, thank you so much, Professor Guru, for such thoughtful comments regarding the presentation. And I'm just so thankful for your comments about the problems of universalism, because you cannot. I think it's important to recognize that you cannot actually have the universal without the particular, right? So what does the concept of contextual universalism allow us to do? It basically allows us to see that any form of universalism arises from a particular. And when you recognize that, you have the tools of criticism of power as it manifests in local contexts, but you also have, to use Karthik's words, the locus of enunciation for a project of emancipation. So, right? So if you ask about how a universal is situated in the particular, then you are able to see who hides behind the universal in India. It is the upper caste Hindu, right? So the project of universalism, of state-led universalism in India, is actually hiding behind a particular, and that is the particularism of an upper caste Hindu project that is trying to become hegemonically universal, right? But what contextual universalism allows you to do is to see how other universalisms arise from within other particular contexts, right? So what was Ambedkar's project of a revitalized Buddhism? It was precisely a contextual universalism. What did it try to do? It tried to come up with a universalizing ideology of emancipation, but from the particularities of Dalit experience, of Dalit local oppression on the ground, instead of from the position of this fake universalism of upper caste Hinduism, right? So if you think about the universal and particular not then as opposed, but necessarily as one thing. The universalism can only be enunciated from some particular position. And only when we pay attention to that can we see what its goals are. Is it truly an ideology of emancipation for universal purposes? Or is it just a false universalism hiding behind the particularities of one group, right? Which is what our state-led Hinduism today is. So I think that this question that you're asking is, Professor Guru, is so important, right? That how do we acknowledge the way that power hides through universalism, right? But while also making space for this critique as tradition, which is universalism, but it's universalism from within the particularities of experience of people on the ground who are suffering and trying to enunciate different loci of emancipation that will include them within its fold.
Mhm. No, I think there are 2 points, Ankit. One is that, I was trying to say whether this contextual universalism pragmatic and dual. So that's my first point, this methodological problem I'm posing. The other one is, does it really resonate with the universalism of Phule, Ambedkar, and Periyar even? Because where do you fit the notion of Maitri? Maitri is not context, but Maitri is universal across time and space. Phule's Sarvajanik Satya Dharma is across time and space. It's not only for India, it's for humanity. So there is this, I think we'll have to solve these problems while we are actually pleading or batting for contextual. I'm not very particular, but I'm saying universal, to claim that I am universal is one thing. And to really have a substantive argument and appeal for universal is another thing. So I think Periyar, Phule, and Ambedkar actually making a substantive claim, appeal. Look here, you have your future tied up with this kind of Maitri. And that's why people in Maharashtra say, whole world will be converted into Buddhism, not only India, Vishwaratna. So I think we have to take into consideration the common sense understanding of all this. They have already reached a super universalism already, going beyond contextual. So that is the whole thing.
There's one question for Professor Bagade, which I'll read out. So, Professor Bagade, I hope you are here. This question is by Sonali Kade from JNU. She's asking, how did Phule try to incorporate non-Brahmin traditions of faith like the cult of Khandoba, which did not have a sophistication of a philosophical system like Charvak and Lokayat, but had a large influence in the faith practices of the Bahujan masses?
Mahatma Phule was building a utopia while writing history. At one hand, he was writing a kind of history where there was no lineage of writing history of Dalit Bahujans or Shudra Atishudra. So Phule's attempt was the first attempt to write history of Shudra and Atishudra. So interestingly, Phule has taken a method from Biko. Biko, in his writing, as I was talking about empiricism, and there was two ways to look at Phule. One was the empiricism coming from the Lokayat tradition, Buddhist tradition, and there is the other way of looking at how Phule was building his method was from the Western tradition, particularly Biko's kind of empiricism. Phule was, in certain sense, was influenced by Biko. And he has taken the ideas, particularly to write alternative history by using myths, by using traditions, that is anthropology in other sense, and by deploying etymology. So Phule was deploying etymology, Phule was deploying traditions, Phule was deploying myths to write history, alternate history of Shudra Atishudra. So there was one way of looking at it, is that how Phule was picking the facts from the mythologies and culture, particularly the living culture of Maharashtra, and he was building a contestation from the tradition. For example, particularly in Brahmin houses, there is a ritual carried out to symbolically kill Bali. Particularly in Dasara, there is a ritual which was practiced, and particularly in non-Brahmin houses, there was a certain kind of celebration of Bali that Ida Pida drove Bali Sarajya by just welcoming the kingdom of Bali. So this is the kind of contradiction which Phule has, in certain sense, pointed out to understand the certain kind of, we can say, conflict between Brahmins and non-Brahmins. And particularly, if at all this struggle is there around Bali, then he has, in certain sense, connected all these local deities as the kind of, we can say, lieutenants of Bali. And here, Khandoba is commemorated. Khandoba is, in certain sense, venerated. Khandoba is, in certain sense, was worshipped. Why this worship is being there? So he, in certain sense, conceived by an idea that the Bali's kingdom was Prajasattak, it was republic, it was a democratic state, it was a state where all kinds of freedoms was allowed. It was a state where the literature, the knowledge, the art progressed. So this was a certain kind of utopia which he built. And that utopia is, in certain sense, was invoked to build a society on that line. So certainly we have two ways to look at why he has incorporated Khandoba. One is that he was building a utopia, and secondly, he wanted to write history of Dalit Bahujan or Shudra-Shudra resistance. This idea of Shudra-Shudra as the actors of history, in certain sense, gives a kind of agency to the Shudra-Shudra that they have to fight against these inequalities and injustices. So this is a certain kind of ways the icon of the Khandoba, icon of Duroba, was incorporated in a certain kind of understanding of history. That would be my answer.
Thank you, Professor Bagade, for that succinct answer. There's a question from Divya addressed to Dr. Karthik. I'll read it out. You've been asked to elaborate more on the thesis of violence should not only be understood in physical terms, but also in structural terms. If you could provide an example of this. And Karthik, if I may just add to this question, given that you've given a very sort of strong marg or path, so to say, for how to practice a more radical politics and thinking as well. I was thinking in terms of certain experiments in naming or nomenclature that starts from Mahatma Phule himself. So for instance, the notion of Ati Shudra, which he comes up with, which also includes women, so that's an entirely new sort of an innovation to bring in a more expansive classes of people under the hegemony of a dominant ideology. And even the Dalit Panther Manifesto, for example, which included not only people who were born as untouchables in the definition of Dalits, but several other classes of exploited people as well. So given that you put a very strong emphasis on not doing a reductionist or identitarian sort of a politics, how do you assess these sorts of experimentations in nomenclature in the anti-caste movement? This and the question put in the chat box here.
Thank you. I could, in fact, give two examples, right? There is a great push in Karnataka to remove eggs from the midday meal scheme, right? Because a minority section of the population will get offended. This to me is like an obscene example of structural violence, right? Where a majority of kids, and by global experts, it has shown that having eggs provides a complete and nutritious meal, especially for children who do not have access to rich varieties of food. To deprive them of this basic nutrition provided through a government midday meal scheme in schools is structural violence. That's one example. Let me give another sort of a very interesting example. I think this happened 6 or 7 years back in maybe it was Pune. A scientist working for the Indian Meteorological Department she advertised for a cook, right? And the requirement was that a Brahmin only cook. So a woman came for the job and she was employed, and later it was discovered that this particular cook was from the Yadav community, right? So she immediately fired her, and instead of the scientist being seen as casteist, a case was filed against this worker for impersonating a different caste and to have sought an employment where only Brahmins are supposed to have been employed, right? Now, no act of violence was committed against this woman, right? Against the cook. No physical harm was actually done. But then this is how the structure of caste functions. So it does not necessarily always involve this extreme acts of murder and, beatings and physical humiliations that we see in the news. It can also involve, events, policy measures, and processes such as these. So that's that. Now, regarding the sort of politics of nomenclature, I mean, it's very remarkable, the entire Dalit Panthers movement, because I feel that they were inspired by a very radical phase of the Black Panthers movement. Recently I was watching this film, Judas and the Black Messiah, right? So where Fred Hampton provides this sort of a very beautiful and broad definition of blackness, and the sort of rainbow coalition which he imagines also tries to involve the working class whites who were earlier racists, right? Who were earlier hardcore racists and were using the N word quite openly, but he is trying to reach out to them and build this sort of a broad working class coalition, and the coalition of different sections of the oppressed against the oppressor elite. And it is no surprise that he gets accidentally killed in a police encounter. So the Dalit Panthers of that period were also quite remarkably similar, because their conception of Dalitness corresponded to oppression as such, right? So it wasn't just restricted, at least this is my understanding, it wasn't just restricted to anyone who bears this identity or this particular experience, but the very sense of commitment to fighting against oppression was prioritized. I think this sort of nomenclatures, of Dalit, of Dravidian, of Atishudra might have been lost or misdirected over time. But then, as the title of our discussion suggests, these are certain traditions from which we derive critiques today. So we can subject these traditions to critique, but also use them to develop new critiques to guide us.
Ankit, I just want to, I think Karthik, your observation was quite important, that physical violence deflects the attention from the structural violence. I think you should have, you should have stuck to that, but let me elaborate on. And the structural violence, the physical violence deflects definitely from the structural violence. Why it deflects? Because it is spectacular, it is immediate close, spectacular. Any spectacular thing will always attract your attention, both in terms of emotions, in terms of your, basically emotions and public commotion. Whereas structural violence will not really announce its arrival. It is so silent. It won't announce it. The causes of violence are processed so subtly that you may not know it. So I think what happened in the post-structural turn to the study of violence is that you actually focus on agency rather than structure. So that's the debate we have in India. The girl who was asking this question, not girl or boy, I don't know. I think this, how is violence processed through structures, and what are the different forms of structures, both caste, class, gender, all that we'll have to actually find out. And then the existence of that violence is only in the physical and the spectacular. And that, I think, is a small point I'm making.
Thank you, sir, for that point. Our cutoff was actually 9 p.m. So we've hit that time here, and unfortunately, we'll not be able to take any more questions. But
I just want to make a small point, Ankit,
Yes,
just a small point about. I'm sorry, I'm not dominating the discussion. I'm really feeling guilty of it. But Umesh's intervention, I think, he will agree, he will endorse this. Do you really have a very lengthy, detailed out, substantive study of how is the Shudra, Ati Shudra, Dalit tradition built up? To say that is there a work on Phule Ambedkar tradition? It's just the slogan, but Umesh has actually opened up window, Buddhism and other things. Historiography and all that. I think the seminal contribution to bring Phule and Ambedkar together, and let us not really reduce them to slogans. Yeah.
I mean, I absolutely agree with that statement as well, sir. And with that, I think I'll, give a brief vote of thanks of sorts to everybody who's present here, who, took time out of this very busy and celebratory week of celebrating the birth anniversaries of Mahatma Phule and Babasaheb Ambedkar. So thanks once again for coming here. Thanks, of course, due to all our panelists for such amazingly, thought-provoking and generative presentations. We'll be thinking about these thoughts and ideas for quite a long time. And a big shout out of thanks to the Engage team, specifically Divya, Priyam, Tia, Johan, and Akanksha, of course, for making the poster, and who have been very expertly carrying the programs of Engage, like this particular webinar. So thanks to them as well. So happy Phule and Ambedkar Jayanti to all of you again. And sir, you want to say something?
Yeah. No. I'm just endorsing whatever you said.
Yeah. So as always, the last word would be that please subscribe to EPW. It carries many of the conversations and discussions that we've been having in this webinar as well. So it would be great if you subscribe to EPW. I would end there with that. Thank you so much again for coming.